Okay, I believe we can officially start. Uh, um, Welcome everyone to today's meeting of the of the Milan seminar in the history of modern moral philosophy. Today's guest is Thomas Ahnert. Thomas is professor of intellectual history at the University of Edinburgh, and although is very well known to everyone working in this field, I would just like to mention a couple of, well, just the most important publications of Thomas, the two books on the moral culture of the Scottish Enlightenment, and one important book on Christian Thomasius, Religion and the Origins of German Enlightenment. And just as important, I would say, for people working in the field, his translations for the Liberty Fund editions of works by Wolf, Thomasius, Heineccius. And now I would say it's Pufendorf's turn. So Thomas, who has already been doing some work on Pufendorf, is working on a larger project on Pufendorf, as you might have catched in the last few minutes. And today's talk is, I suppose, part of that larger project. As you can already see from the slide Thomas has already shared, our topic today is conflict sociality and the state in the thought of Samuel Pufendorf. So without further ado, thanks very much, Thomas, for accepting our invitation, for being part of our series. And we look very much forward to your talk. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for the kind introduction, and to Michael, to both of you for inviting me. So, yes, this is really my first attempt to get to grips with Pufendorf's political theory. Now, it's very often argued that the moral and political thought of Samuel Pufendorf was a response to the problem of civil conflict or civil strife in the mid-17th century. And in particular to the experience of the devastating wars associated with, caused by the religious divisions within Western Christianity. So the Finnish scholar Matti Koskiniemi, for example, has said that Pufendorf's, quote, political project was to find a technique for the maintenance of social peace on a durable basis. And another example of that sort of view is from the Australian scholar Ian Hunter, who has said that Pufendorf, I quote, had first-hand experience of the problems states confronted in attempting to establish deconfessionalized civil orders in the wake of protracted confessional conflict. And many other authors have argued very similarly that Pufendorf's ideas on politics and the state were intended to resolve the threat of civil conflict. Now, I mean, civil conflict is not a new phenomenon in the 17th century, but it is often assumed that in some sense the conflicts which occurred in that period were unprecedented in their nature and their scale, and they therefore required a novel theoretical response. And this is argued in part because of the prominent role within these conflicts of the religious divisions within Western Christianity. So Pufendorf's solution, it is often said, was to offer a new secular conception of sovereignty and the state, which sort of insulated politics from the instability caused by theological controversy. So, I mean, Pufendorf was, of course, he was very much aware of the effects of political conflict, and it would have been surprising if he had not been. He was born in Saxony in 1632 at the height of the 30 Years' War. Now, but as I shall argue here, the moral and legal theories he presented in various works on moral philosophy, in particular, so the Elementa Jurisprudentia Universalis of 1660, the De Jure Naturae et Gentium of 1672, and the abridged textbook version of the latter, the De Officio Hominis et Civis of 1673, I would say were not motivated by the perceived need to provide a solution to the problem of civil strife. And they were not even really, I think, intended as a response or primarily or directly a response to the specific problem of civil strife caused by religious conflict between different confessions. So I don't think that Pufendorf's project is to come up with a new theory of sovereignty and the state. I don't think that this is the central aim, his central intention. However, there are two main ways, I think, in which Pufendorf's political theory has been interpreted as a response to conflict. And these two ways, they're not mutually exclusive, and they can even overlap, but I think they're conceptually separate. And the first of these is the idea that Pufendorf regarded the state as an abstract person that was distinct from its individual members. And the other idea, which is not quite the same because it doesn't necessarily entail the same kind of argumentative sort of hinterland and background, that is the idea that Pufendorf secularized the state and introduced a strict separation between politics and religious belief. So Ian Hunter, for example, is an example of that. He's argued that Pufendorf was aiming to, I quote, drive a wedge between the duties of the Christian and those of the citizen. So I'll argue that I think neither of these two views is plausible. Before turning towards the end to try and show towards the end that Pufendorf's moral, theory, ethics and political theory can be understood instead as a response really to a different kind of conflict, namely the intellectual divisions and confusion caused by scholastic philosophy, which Pufendorf regarded as an incoherent mixture of philosophical and theological thought. So this false and muddled intellectual system, he believed, could also be a cause of civil strife because it lacked the clarity and certainty it needed to be a useful, sort of robust guide in ethical questions. And Pufendorf's moral theory, I think, was meant to help end this confusion by forming part of a reformed, non-scholastic or post-scholastic curriculum at universities. So it's not so much about formulating a more robust theory of the secular state that preserved its independence from religion. In fact, Pufendorf often emphasized or argued that true religion, in fact, reinforced political stability. So his aim, I think, was rather to turn ethics into a science that is a branch of philosophy which was suitable for demonstrative reasoning and which was thus taken out of the fruitless controversies which had beset the discipline, that is the discipline of moral philosophy. So I'll now, in the first section, turn to the belief that Pufendorf was trying to define the political state as an abstract person distinct from its members and explain why I think that this doesn't quite work. So this idea of the state as an abstract person distinct from its members is, of course, commonly associated with Hobbes, and in particular his famous passage in the Leviathan, where he distinguishes between natural and feigned or artificial persons. So he says, a person is he whose words or actions are considered either as his own or as representing the words or actions of another man, any other man, or of any other thing to which they are attributed, whether truly or by fiction. When they are considered as his own, then is he called a natural person. And when they are considered as representing the words or actions of another, then is he a feigned or artificial person. Now, it is often said that Pufendorf closely followed Hobbes in regarding the state in similar terms, as an artificial person. And that view is to be found already in the Deutsche Genossenschaftsrecht by Otto von Gierke, and importantly, I think for this scholarly tradition, the partial English translation of that by Ernest Barker from 1934. So Gierke, in Barker's translation, writes that Pufendorf approximated pretty closely to Hobbes when he postulated, quote, the subjection of the powers and wills of all to the power and will of a single man or body of men, to the end that the sum of associated individuals should be represented by a person who could act as a single unit. So the term used by Pufendorf for this abstract person was persona moralis composita. Now Gierke did note an important difference between this composite moral person in Pufendorf's thought and Hobbes's artificial person of the state. Composite moral persons, he said, had a collective, but not necessarily a representative unity. So composite moral persons included every societas, be it church, be it church, state, church, local community, corporation, or family, even when that societas involved no representation. For Hobbes, by contrast, no community could even exist without representation. So according to Gierke, Pufendorf was thereby trying to unite the two ideas of collective and representative unity. Now, related to this view was Pufendorf's theory of the formation of political society, which, unlike Hobbes's account, assumed two covenants rather than just one. So, according to Pufendorf, individuals first formed a pre-political community, which then, by majority vote, decided to create a state and issued a decree on the form of government they wanted to adopt, before concluding a second covenant with a person or group of people who were to be entrusted with political authority within that state. And Hobbes, of course, believed that, a multitude convened to create a sovereign and then dispersed. They did not form a community separate from the state. But nevertheless, Pufendorf's conception of the state is often considered to be very close to Hobbes's. Gierke, as we have seen, is an example, and Ernest Barker he reinforces that view in a footnote on Gierke's text. And there Barker suggests that while Pufendorf believed that a community can exist, quote, without any need for the idea of a representative ruling authority to constitute or create it, in order that this person may become real, Pufendorf goes on to introduce the idea of a representative ruling authority in the person of which the community attains, quote, real personality. And that thus Barker adds, he has not, after all, attained the idea that the composite moral person is real in and by itself. So, based on this, the differences between Pufendorf and Hobbes therefore seem to be variations on a similar idea or just differences in degree. And that view, I think, has come to be widely accepted in the secondary literature. So Quentin Skinner, for example, has argued that, I quote, perhaps the most important conduit for the transmission of this doctrine, and by that he means the Hobbesian view of the person of the state as the seat of sovereignty, was Samuel Pufendorf's treatise of 1672, the De Jure Naturae et Gentium. So, as Skinner says, Pufendorf offered, I quote, an analysis of state power which is Hobbesian in character. Though, Skinner adds, Pufendorf also offered, I quote, a much fuller account than than Hobbes had done, of the two different worlds we simultaneously inhabit. One is the world of nature, while the other is the artificial world we construct for ourselves when we agree to follow a common life and regulate it by the rule of law. So other recent literature, I think, has reaffirmed the Hobbesian character of Pufendorf's notion of the state. So Ian Hunt and Knut Håkansson, for example, have described Pufendorf's notion of the state in quite sort of Hobbesian terms, saying that, I quote, far from expressing the natural unity of human reason and will, for Pufendorf, the unity of the state as a moral person is an artifice arising from the need to overcome human disunity and recalcitrance. Okay, but I think there's at least one very important difference between Pufendorf's idea of composite moral persons, quite fundamental difference between his idea of composite moral persons and Hobbes's idea of the artificial person of the state. And this is the fact that composite moral persons, according to Pufendorf, are not artificial. So the moral person of the state, according to Pufendorf, is a moral entity. And like all moral entities, it is imposed on physical nature by intelligent agents who have free will. Now, the moral entities of natural law are known to have been imposed by God. The composite moral person of the state is a product of human positive laws. Thus, it is not natural. But that does not mean it is artificial. So Pufendorf clarifies this distinction between natural, artificial, and moral at the very, very end of the De Jure Naturae Gentium, literally in the last couple of paragraphs. And what he writes there is this. So he says, and this the English is the English translation published in Oxford in 1710. The ligament or tie of the body are joined and united is threefold: natural, artificial, and moral. The natural tie or bond is that by which natural bodies are contained. The artificial is that by which things otherwise divided in nature are, by human industry, brought to an unity and continuity. And the moral tie, lastly, is that by which several individuals are connected by human institution and supposed to make one body. And this body may indeed consist of beasts, as in a flock or herd, but here I suppose it to extend no further than a combination of a number of men. And from these different modes of union result those three sorts of bodies: the natural, artificial, and moral. So this disagreement with Hobbes is more than just kind of terminological. An artificial body for Pufendorf is, for example, I don't know, a candlestick or a pocket watch. So artifice means creating a new physical body by joining other separately existing physical bodies to each other physically. But the ties between the members of composite moral bodies are not physical. Therefore, these bodies are not a product of artifice and are thus not artificial. So, moreover, for Pufendorf, the purpose of these composite moral bodies, even the state, including the state, is not, as it is for Hobbes, to substitute the will of the artificial person, an artificial person, for the wills of its individual members. Now, it is true that Pufendorf believes that the state, qua moral person, needs to have a single unitary will, as well as a single intellect, or should have a single unitary will, as well as a single intellect, like any other person, moral or natural, because otherwise it's not a person, at least not a healthy, functioning person. And the importance of this sort of facultative aspect of personhood for Pufendorf's understanding of the state has recently been very rightly emphasized by Ben Holland in his book. But the purpose of the single will of Pufendorf's state is not to kind of replace or subsume the wills of its members. The state is not the product of artifice, which is something Pufendorf restricts to the physical world anyway, and which has effects that are different from those brought about by the creation of a moral composite body. The problem Pufendorf is trying to solve is not to kind of overcome the diversity or plurality of wills in a state by somehow sort of transmogrifying this plurality of wills into a single will. And an important reason why Pufendorf is not trying to do so is that for him, conflict is not the structural, systemic feature of the pre-political state, which it is for Hobbes. So Hobbes states, famously, because the condition of man, as hath been declared in the precedent chapter, is a condition of war of everyone against everyone. The condition of man is a condition of war of everyone against everyone, in which case everyone is governed by his own reason, and there's nothing he can make use of that may not be a help unto him in preserving his life against his enemies. It followeth that in such a condition every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body, and therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security to any man, how strong or wise soever he be, of living out the time which nature ordinarily alloweth men to live. So, by contrast, in Pufendorf's pre-political state, there's not the same absence of norms as there is in Hobbes's. And this is the point on which Pufendorf very deliberately sets himself apart from Hobbes. For he says, contrary to Hobbes, the law of nature is not altogether dumb, even in a state of nature, though indeed there's much greater security of having this law obeyed under civil government, where the power of the magistrate is at hand to compel those who are wanting in returns of kindness and peace. But notwithstanding all this, thus much prudence suggests to us that we should not only provide by a timely defence against the open and professed malice of wicked men, but that we should likewise esteem the goodness of others not infallible and immutable. And to answer all these ends, no such universal safeguard as civil society could be invented or conceived. But so conflict in the pre-political state, Pufendorf is saying, it's an aberration from an already existing standard of moral conduct. It's not an inherent sort of systemic feature. And individuals will, in fact, act according to that standard, at least, quite much of the time. They may not always do so out of a desire to be moral, but for a variety of reasons, including self-interest, their education, and the examples of others. And these reasons also mean that individuals do not have to be aware of, let alone understand, the law of nature to act according to it. But the important point is that for Pufendorf, the cause of conflict in a pre-political state is not the plurality of wills itself. The result is that as to the discharge of duties, natural duties from others to me, I cannot have it in a state of nature so well secured as under civil government, yet neither is it left in so miserable an uncertainty as that hereby I must be obliged, or may be permitted, to treat all men in a hostile manner. So the relationship of civil government to the pre-political community depends on the nature and causes of this, quote, uncertainty in the state of nature. Although there is a standard of moral behavior and justice prior to the state, some individuals will from time to time deviate from that, and they do so in part because human nature after the fall from grace is full of corrupt passions that interfere with the proper exercise of human free will. But humans also do that because natural law lacks sanctions, or at least sanctions that are so clear and evident that they are suitable for deterring individuals from immoral conduct. As Pufendorf says, but because whatever arguments we can allege a priori will not amount to demonstration, but only to a high probability, and because this arbitrary punishment presupposes some positive determination of the divine will, which we can hardly come to a knowledge of without a particular revelation, and since our induction and our experience are present imperfect, we can scarce avoid confessing that to those who see only by the light of natural reason, this controversy must still appear in some measure dark and obscure. Now this comment may seem kind of surprising, since Pufendorf, we know, believes that natural law is founded in God's commands for humankind. So it seems self-evident then that God would also enforce these commands as any human legislator would. God's omnipotent or all-seeing and so on. So why doesn't God enforce natural law and make it effective, also to deter people from wrongdoing? But I think drawing that conclusion or sort of seeing that as a problem would reflect a misunderstanding of Pufendorf's intentions in formulating his voluntarist theory of natural law, because his aim, I would suggest, is not to turn God into something akin to a human legislator who's is waiting to back up his laws with a threat of punishment. So the reason why Pufendorf says that the moral entities of natural law are imposed by God is that this is how he proves their hypothetical necessity, which is the key to making natural law capable of the kind of scientific demonstration which he is aiming for in ethics. So the moral entities of natural law are what God must have wanted for humans, given their particular physical created nature. Their origin in God's will is the reason for their existence and their demonstrability. So God does not need them actually to be enforced in order for them to retain the character of laws that are demonstrable scientifically. And for Pufendorf, by the way, scientific means demonstrable by means of syllogistic argument. So as Pufendorf puts it, so man obtained a social nature from the good pleasure of God Almighty, not from any immutable necessity. So it's not absolute necessity, this is hypothetical necessity. And consequently, the morality of actions agreeable or disagreeable to him as a social creature must be derived from the same original and spring, and must be attributed to man not by an absolute, but by an hypothetical necessity, or upon supposal of that condition which God was pleased freely to bestow on mankind above the privileges of the inferior creation. So moral entities were therefore necessary, firstly in the sense that they had to exist, and secondly in the sense that they could not exist in any other form. But they were not made necessary by being part of the physical created nature of humankind. The reason they were necessary is that they were imposed by God. Because they were necessary, they were also a suitable foundation for the kind of demonstrative proof which Pufendorf was seeking to introduce into ethical reasoning. So the purpose of Pufendorf's voluntarism, really, to repeat, is not to make God responsible for enforcing natural law, or indeed, it's also not his purpose is not to detach moral precepts from, quote, transcendent reasons and laws, as has been argued. Rather, this voluntarism is an essential part of his argument that it is possible to have a science of ethics. So it was, of course, evident to anyone that transgressors of natural law were not immediately kind of struck down by lightning or punished by some other means, which was obviously of divine origin. So, as Pufendorf explained, neither the fear of God nor the sting of conscience are found to have sufficient force to restrain the evil that is in men. Divine vengeance tends to proceed at a slow pace, and this gives opportunity to the wicked among mankind to ascribe the sufferings of the impious to other causes, especially as they often see them abundantly provided with those things by which the vulgar measure happiness. So, I mean, a common response to this sort of dilemma, bad things happen to good people and the wicked prosper, a common response to that by contemporaries was that punishments and rewards which were earned but not distributed in this life would then be reserved for the afterlife, to be inflicted or bestowed on a soul that survived the physical disintegration of the body. Now, Pufendorf, however, did not believe that the immortality of the soul and the existence of divine justice in an afterlife were known to humans through natural reason. Of course, he believed in it, but this was the truth. This was a truth granted by revelation. If you wanted to play the game of philosophy, stay within the rules of philosophy, then you had no clear arguments for that. So Pufendorf's natural religion, unlike that of many of his contemporaries, did not include knowledge of the immortality of the soul. And that's one reason why he seemed very close to reducing morality to a sort of quote-unquote Epicurean form of utility or self-interest, as Leibniz commented in one of his letters when he said that, I find it very bad that celebrated people such as Pufendorf teach that one knows the immortality of the soul as well as the pains and rewards which await us beyond this life only through revelation. All doctrines of morals, of justice, of duties, which are based only on the goods of this life, can be only very imperfect. Take away the natural immortality of the soul, and the doctrine of providence is useless, and has no more power to obligate men than the gods of Epicurus, which are without providence. So, according to Pufendorf, it's this lack of sanctions which leads to the formation of the state, as a means of reinforcing those precepts which are necessary for sociality. But again, this sort of creation of the state, it does not require the plurality of wills in the state of nature to be subsumed in the single will of the state. It only requires the creation of another composite moral person one that has the power to compel the observance of natural law with credible threats of immediate punishment. So the state, therefore, is different from other moral bodies, other composite moral bodies. It's distinct because it has coercive power. But this is a specific feature of the state. It's not a power which the state has taken from other moral bodies. The state does not, therefore, it doesn't replace other moral bodies, whether these are single or composite. It's rather kind of layered on top of them. It's sort of super added to them. So now, while the will of the state, according to Pufendorf, doesn't represent the wills of its members in the way that Hobbes' artificial person of the state does, Pufendorf does expect the state, as I mentioned earlier, to have a single will. But that's just because a person, any kind of person, single, composite, moral, natural, needs a single will to function properly. And actually, even the absence of a single will does not mean there is no state at all. It just means there's a rather disordered, imperfect state, just as an individual with a personality disorder does not cease to be a person. So such a state may still be able to exercise some coercive power, but it will not function as effectively or as it should. The problem here for Pufendorf is not even so much that the practical effectiveness of sanctions, of coercive measures that is the main problem. It's the fact that no person, natural or moral, should have multiple wills. And Pufendorf draws an explicit analogy here to the human soul, the human soul to which the sovereign authority in a state seems to bear some resemblance. Now, should we suppose the potential parts of the rational soul, the understanding and the will, to exist separately in two different subjects or suppositums, one of which should have only the faculty of understanding, the other only the faculty of the will, neither of these suppositums could not, says not, but be called a man, nor could human actions be expected from either, whilst one lay inactive and immovable, the other blind and insensible. So the single unitary will in Pufendorf's state is therefore very different from that in Hobbes's. That difference also helps to explain Pufendorf's, I think, his comparatively detached comments on the irregular form of government of the Holy Roman Empire, which he writes about in the 1667 De Statu Imperii Germanici, published under the pseudonym of Severinus da Monzambano, a fictional Veronese nobleman. And there Pufendorf had famously described the empire as a state which was monstro simile. The crucial qualification, of course, was that this was true only siquidem and regula scientiae civilis exigatur, insofar as it is measured by the rules of civil science. I mean, all that he's saying here really is that the constitution of the Holy Roman Empire cannot be categorized by using the standard Aristotelian typology. It is rather an irregular state, which is sort of somewhere, swithering between a system of states and a limited monarchy. And there are many disadvantages to this irregular form of government, especially because it does not have a very consistent unitary will, but actually it is not a state. It's not even a diseased state, because Pufendorf distinguishes between an irregular and a diseased state. And the latter, the diseased state, always appears, he says, under circumstances of ignominy. It proceeds either from the ill management of a good and regular frame, or from incoherent laws and improper institutions. The disease in this case, quote, cannot be supposed to have entered into the intention of those who first founded the Commonwealth, ever appearing as a subsequent vice or defect. And the difference between sort of regular and diseased is similar to that, he thinks, to that between a house which is, quote, designed according to the rules of architecture, but either the materials are naught, or through the negligence of the inhabitants, the roof gapes, the walls shake, the beams crack, the foundation sinks and gives way. And then another in which, quote, either the builder at first proposed a model not agreeable to the common rules, or some great fault which afterwards happened hath been cured and made up after a strange and unseemly manner. Has often been noted that Pufendorf tones down his criticism of the empire in the later edition of the Monzambano, which appeared posthumously, but incorporated Pufendorf's own final changes to the text. And possible, and I think a plausible explanation for this shift is that the wars launched by Louis XIV and the Ottoman threat in the East led Pufendorf to place greater value on the need for unity among the emperor and the empire's estates. It has also been argued that his attitude softened because he had come to accept the possibility of the empire as a composite state that had a common head. And that's something that Ben Holland has suggested. He said that there were religio-political reasons for this shift. As Holland writes, Pufendorf had hoped to supply a political scientific rationale for religious peace in Germany. There were solid pragmatic reasons, Holland says, that the figure of the emperor ought to be regarded as a supreme sovereign, able to punish uncivil or unsociable behavior, and to confer the benefits of peace and prosperity on his subjects. At the same time, according to Holland, Pufendorf wanted to preserve the right of the empire's Protestant estates to resist the Catholic emperor. And Holland concludes that Pufendorf thus found himself having to formulate a theory of sovereignty that could confound the internecine conflict in the empire, but at the same time allow Protestant societies the right at some point to desist from obeying their sovereign. Pufendorf, Holland argues, now regarded the Holy Roman Empire as an example of a composite state. So that's what the position he arrives at in the later Monzambano. But and Holland relies on passages from the De Jure Naturae Gentium and arguing for that. But I mean, the relevant passages, that's especially chapter 5 and book 7 of the De Jure Naturae, which Holland refers to, that does not really bear this out, I think. Pufendorf there discusses the possibility of a system of states with one single head. And, in moral bodies, he said that implied no contradiction to have but one person, to have but one person the head of many distinct bodies, because the union of these systems is founded either in the sole person of the prince or in his family. Hence it comes to pass that when the person is deceased or the family extinct, the respective people recover their particular right of settling their own government and are no longer obliged to make use of a common head. Nay, during the continuance of the said head, the states are really distinct from each other. But I really don't think that this description of a system of states suggests a re-evaluation of the empire as a composite state, and one reason is the fact that Pufendorf does not mention the empire once in this passage, which is couched in very general terms. And moreover, more importantly, the ways in which these systems of states with a common head come about are not really applicable to the empire. So Pufendorf states that, quote, causes when such combinations arise are various, but the most frequent seem to be the marriages of princes and the right of inheritance. But the empire did not originate in the combination of territories through marriage or through inheritance. The emperor himself was chosen by the 7 electoral princes, and the cases Pufendorf, actually 8 by then, the cases Pufendorf has in mind here are more typical of the dynastic policies of territorial princes within the empire, such as, I don't know, the Elector of Saxony, or in the wider European ambitions of the Austrian Habsburgs, who, for example, would later add the former Spanish Netherlands to their possessions. But the empire itself was not a regular composite state, according to those terms, and really no grounds to believe that Pufendorf considered it as such. And even the posthumous edition of the Monzombano, in the posthumous edition, Pufendorf reiterated his earlier view that the empire came closest to, quote, a system of several independent states united by a league or confederacy. And there's also, I think, no reason to suppose that Pufendorf expected the emperor to enforce or to be specially responsible for enforcing the religious peace among the estates of the empire, and the emperors lacked the practical means to do so. I don't think there's any textual evidence that Pufendorf looked to the emperor as a guarantor of confessional harmony. And it's not clear to me also why Pufendorf should have changed his mind on that issue between the first and the posthumous edition of the Monzombano, because confessional tensions remain in the empire even after the Westphalian peace treaties, but they were not more prominent in the 1680s than they had been in the 1660s. So I still think that the most plausible explanation is the central role of the Habsburgs in defending the empire against increasing military threats from France and the Ottoman Empire from the 1670s. So it's a slight digression, but so basically, I mean, Pufendorf, I think, is not motivated by, he's not coming up with this sort of quasi-Hobbesian notion of the state as an abstract artificial person representing its individual members, and he doesn't do this as a, he's not motivated by the threat of conflict to come up with an idea like that. But there's still the other interpretation I want to consider, namely the idea that, or argument that he's trying to resolve the particular problem of religious conflict, not so much at the level of the empire, but within the territorial states of the empire. And the question whether he does so, not by turning the state into a sort of Hobbesian artificial person, but whether he does so by secularizing the foundations of political authority and legitimacy, and that's what I'll turn to now. So the argument that Pufendorf was aiming to secularize the foundations of political authority has been put forward by, for example, Ian Hunter, who has said that Pufendorf's project was to develop an ethics and politics suited to the desacralized states sanctioned by the treaties of Westphalia. Because Pufendorf, Hunter writes, was faced with the challenge of establishing, quote, deconfessionalized civil orders in the wake of protracted confessional conflict. So Hunter has emphasized especially the power of the secular ruler to impose moral entities on subjects. So these moral entities are the free creation of the ruler's will. They are examples of pure, positive law. And because they are, according to Hunter, thus not bound by any abstract moral norms, they are flexible enough to serve a very immediate practical purpose, namely the preservation of civil peace. Moreover, these positive laws, it is argued, are so useful because they do not reflect or require a particular confessional religious commitment. So civil peace is a practical normative standard which is immune to the religious disagreements between the different Christian churches that had led to conflicts like the 30 Years' War, which Pufendorf had lived through as an adolescent. So, and yet, I think it's not really plausible to argue that Pufendorf's driving concern was to insulate political authority, or to secularize to insulate it political authority from the threat of religious differences of opinion by secularizing it. There's one brief passing comment in the De Jure Naturae Gentium on the possibility that religious disagreement might lead to conflict. And it's really one passing comment. And Pufendorf's point there, in fact, is that religious differences of opinion are not really the real cause of civil strife. So what he says there is, there is indeed scarce any one opinion, either relating to the worship of God, or concerning those things, the knowledge of which is strictly termed human, but may be made the occasion of dissension, discord, reviling, and in the final issue of blood and war. And this does not happen on account of the falsity of the opinion, or because to admit the contrary would bring heavy inconveniences on mankind or on civil communities, but by reason of men's unhappy dispositions, who always imagining themselves to be wise, would gladly appear so to all others, and are violently enraged against those who presume to be of the contrary persuasion. This anyone will readily confess, who hath but chanced to cast his eye on those quarrels of the learned about mere trifles, carried on with no less heat and fury than if their lives and religions lay at stake. So the main threat to social peace was the uncontrolled passions and intellectual limitations which prevented humans from recognizing what they were obliged to do, or from wanting to act according to their obligations. As Pufendorf wrote, I quote, "The corruption of most human beings is so great that whenever they expect a greater good for themselves from the violation of the laws than from their observance, they will happily violate them." So these uncontrolled passions might, of course, be expressed in religious conflict, but the problem these passions represented was not specific to religion. It is also the case that only false religious beliefs could be harnessed by corrupt passions. So civil peace depended not so much, I think, for Pufendorf, on secularizing political authority, but on reforming and purifying religion. As Pufendorf said, although it was important that, although it was important that the state do publicly own and profess such doctrines as are agreeable to the end and design of civil government, and the minds of the subjects be from their childhood grounded in them. Pufendorf said it was important that the state do, etc. And the power of examining the aforesaid pernicious doctrines or of banishing them from civil societies is justly attributed to the supreme ruling authority. It's also the case, he said, that no true and just opinions will be in danger of suffering by the censure, for no doctrine is opposite to the common peace, for no true doctrine is opposite to the common peace, and that which doth not contradict peace cannot be true, unless we may at the same time affirm that peace and concord are repugnant to the laws of nature. So Pufendorf never suggested that solving confessional conflict required a non-religious principle of legislation, or kind of stripping, just removing all religion entirely. In fact, he believed that the uncorrupted principles of Christianity not only did not interfere with either natural laws or well-founded positive laws, but in fact strengthened their observance and supported social peace in ways that human laws never could, because civil laws are concerned with repressing vices in a crude fashion and remove deceit to the extent that they can get hold of it. But they conceal a great part of human malice and leave it unpunished. They only ban the more serious evils by using punishment. They pass over the minor ones as if they were not worthy of attention because the praetor is overworked in dealing with them. And yet these cause not a little irritation, and if they persist are a thorn in the flesh. So, of course, this does not mean that rulers could instrumentalize Christianity and turn it into some sort of civil religion, which was directed by political interests. As Pufendorf said, no sane person would assert that the prince has the right to shape or interpolate Christian religion as he pleases in any way that differs from the clear word of God. But there is, to use Michael Seidler's term, a systemic consistency between the aims of the secular state and those of religion, and it is not necessary or even helpful to cut the secular state off from religion. Rather, what is necessary is to remove, or at least contain, the influence of corrupt religion by regulating the doctrines that are publicly disseminated. Now, the extent to which this was possible in the Holy Roman Empire after 1648, with the tri-confessional regime established by the Westphalian treaties, was of course limited. What is also necessary is to avoid a situation in which an external authority has the right to teach and disseminate doctrines within the Commonwealth which affect its peace and security. As Pufendorf writes, to the same authority, civil authority, it must belong to take cognizance of doctrines and opinions of such, especially as bear any relation to the end of civil government, and which are of force and efficacy, either in promoting or in hindering obedience to the sovereign ruler. For if one should command the subjects to do a thing under pain of temporal death, and another persuade them that to do it would be to incur eternal death, and each by his own rights separately and independently enjoyed, the consequence must be not only that the subjects, though innocent, may be justly punished, but also that the state must sink into an irregular system, a monster with two heads. Of course, he has in mind the Pope. So this is not about secularizing the state, but it's about preventing external interference of any kind in it. And Pufendorf obviously has in mind the papacy. But the problem is not religion itself, it's the irregular, monstrous system of political rule with no single unitary will, which results from this external interference. So, I mean, of course, Pufendorf is certainly conscious of the threat of political conflict, and he's like, as anyone would be, he's keen to avoid it. But it's not, I think, he's not trying to address this threat by means of a new secular theory of sovereignty. And so political conflict, it doesn't have the sort of transformative causal force, I think, that is often attributed to it in interpretations of his thought and his moral theories, ethics in particular. So the sense in which his sort of conflict does play a role, I think it's a more sort of oblique sense that his natural jurisprudence, his moral theory, is intended as a response to conflict. And that's something I'll turn to really quite sort of briefly now, because what I would like to suggest, sort of in conclusion really, is that I mean, the natural jurisprudence of the De Jure Naturae Gentium was meant to turn ethics into scientific discipline, which for Pufendorf was meant a discipline capable of demonstrative proof, and for him this means syllogistic proof, and thereby Pufendorf's wanted his natural law theory to be a remedy for the intellectual confusion sown by scholastic philosophy, which was itself a product of the religious corruption that had affected Western Christianity with the rise of the papal church from late antiquity onwards. So, and Pufendorf's religious thought and his views in ecclesiastical history, they've been the subject of a growing body of literature for some time. There's Simone Zurbuchen's groundbreaking work on natural religion and Pufendorf's thought, and there also the equally very important studies of the late German scholar Detlef Döring on Pufendorf as a theologian. And as they've emphasized, Pufendorf, he was a committed Lutheran throughout his life, even if he sometimes quarreled with exponents of more orthodox forms of Lutheranism. His posthumous Jus Veciale Divinum of 1695 was written from the perspective of a committed Lutheran. He was sufficiently close to the Pietist reform movement within Lutheranism for Pietism's leading representative, Philipp Jakob Spener, to give Pufendorf's funeral sermon in 1694. And even when he served as court historiographer to the Calvinist elect of Brandenburg, he was consistently critical of the idea of predestination associated with Calvinist theology. And in fact, far from sort of pursuing the aim of sort of secularization, Pufendorf's aim was to reform and purify Western Christianity. And he thought that if this was accomplished, divisions and conflict would also be, this would help to overcome divisions and conflict. Now, he acknowledged the difficulties in achieving this goal. He certainly did not count on imminent success. And his commitment to that goal, it is true, did not amount to a kind of practical plan of action. And it did not really lead to sort of determined political effort or campaigning on his part. But Pufendorf's general interest in the restoration of true Christian religion, I think, is relevant to his intellectual project of a new science of ethics. Because I think one of Pufendorf's main aims in developing such a science was to offer an alternative to the scholastic philosophy, which was, first of all, the ideological tool of the spiritual monarchy of the Roman papacy, which he believed was, one of the root causes of the corruption and fragmentation of Western Christendom. And this science of ethics was a way of part of his project of sort of clearing up the intellectual confusion that underpinned the system of scholastic philosophy, which was present, he thought, not only at Catholic universities, but even at Lutheran universities in the 17th century, in the universities of the 17th century Holy Roman Empire. So he first makes an attempt at creating this moral science in the elements. He's dissatisfied with that. So De Jure Naturae Gentium, 1672, is his second attempt at a moral science intended to show that ethics is capable of demonstrative certainty and doesn't have to be limited to sort of prudential considerations, as Aristotle had argued. And this science of ethics, I think he intended that to be taught at universities as part of a reformed post-scholastic curriculum for jurists, public servants who passed through these institutions. So I'll end on that note, but I think that is the sort of nature of Pufendorf's moral ethical project, and in some ways I think the idea of framing this as somehow an immediate response to the political chaos of the mid-late 17th century is intellectually it doesn't translate, it doesn't immediately explain the shape his moral political theory takes. But I'll finish here. Thank you very much.